Well, if there was one session that could encapsulate this entire conference, surely this is the one. And so I want to congratulate you for making the difficult choice, I know, between this session and listening to Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa to be in this room with us. It's my great pleasure to introduce yet another member of the International Students Committee to you, and Lukas Schindler. Lukas is a business administration student here in St. Gallen and has worn a couple of hats in his 1 year with the symposium. Lukas.
Thank you for this brief introduction, Catherine. And today I want to show you something.
Step into the spotlight, Lukas.
Today I want to demonstrate to you something which I have learned during my past year in the communications department, which is really important. And this is coming directly to the point you're trying to make. So, the 1990s were characterized by widespread optimism that the end of the Cold War would usher in a new era of global cooperation. This optimism has faded in the recent decade, most recently in the light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are in a phase of deep reckoning with globalization and interdependence. While this interconnection lifted hundreds of thousands out of poverty, it created inequalities with lasting and dividing impact.
In his time as EU Commission President, José Manuel Barroso tried to insulate Europe from the negative effects of globalization by creating a fund that would redistribute and strengthen European economies that needed to be strengthened at a time when globalization could have threatened the way that they do business and live their lives. But now globalization is so ubiquitous, we have come and have had to accept that with massive economic shifts, with not only a digital revolution, but with a data revolution and all the closer infrastructural personal connections that we have, new threats come hand in hand with new opportunities, but also the need to resolve these transnational problems together. It's our great pleasure to bring to the stage for this discussion CNN Europe editor Nina dos Santos and her panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be back here with you this afternoon again. You get 2 doses of Nina dos Santos, and I get 1 wonderful dose of the Gallen Symposium in person this year. As you just heard there from Catherine's introduction, this session is specifically focused on global public goods, and the objective of our conversation is to try and figure out how we can generate ideas to revive cooperation after, of course, the last few years and the tumult recently of the early part of this year geopolitically. So, just a quick word of introduction, some thoughts. The 1990s, and I see that judging by most of the people I can see in the room, you probably, like me, will remember the 1990s, but for some of you who are here, who are students who were probably born then and don't, take it from us that they were characterized by an era of optimism, that the Cold War was over and we'd see this sort of great big era of global cooperation ushered in. Obviously, we know now over the last couple of years, and particularly the last few months of this year, that that kind of optimism has been fading pretty fast, thanks, of course, to the pandemic and most recently Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So some of the most pressing issues of the day, like climate change, global health, food security, all require collective action and a lot more cooperation that we're seeing between countries, because these are obviously dependent on events happening not just within one country, but beyond countries' borders. So we want to explore the prospect of protecting access to global public goods and how much cooperation is needed to be shored up. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel, some of whom you probably already recognise. To my left is, of course, José Manuel Barroso, former Portuguese Prime Minister, European Commission head, and also you're on the board of the Gavi Alliance as well at the moment, aren't you? Professor Maya Göpel, who's a political economist and also author, an advisor to the German government, I believe. And we have, last but not least, Marcela Escobari, who many of you may remember has been a panelist here as well at St. Gallen in years gone by. Marcela is currently the Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And I'm going to open the floor up very quickly to all of you, because this is quite an intimate gathering, to ask questions. I suppose the first question should be to you, Maria. There are many economists among us, but this concept of global public goods, could you just lay out what they are, why they're so important, and what's going to happen?
Is this to Marcela or to
Maria? Sorry, Maria
Maya?
first. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Apologies.
Sorry.
As our resident economist in the middle.
Right, okay. Well, the interesting bit is I'm a political economist, right? So we're interested in institutions as well, and issues like power and interest, which is something that economists shy away from addressing a lot. And I think it is one of the aspects that we might want to focus more on when we're talking about which solutions can actually bring us forward. But first, typically a public or global public good is one of the ones that are non-rival because something is created that everyone can benefit from. Sort of exceeding territories, when we're talking about now understanding how connected we were, those could only be created because they were beyond borders. Then they're non-exclusionary, so we would all benefit from them being around. I've been thinking in the last session, peace should be at the very highest ranking, probably, in that concept. But then they're also available more or less on a worldwide scale. And still, we see, and I would like to add this one as one more aspect, the global commons, which is something that is also a global issue, which is typically referred to when we're talking about ecosystems, that also can only be managed if we look beyond borders, but they are actually rival. So the way that we're using them is going to degrade them. So I think there's two aspects there. One, typically when we talk about public goods being non-rival, we'd be saying more information, more knowledge, or in like patent or new vaccinations, if they're patent on our nose, the big question that we've been haggling with, that we're being brought out that can help the world community address challenges like we've had or still have with the pandemic. It seems very odd to be without a mask amongst people again to me. So yes, it is the proof that a cooperation is going to create such great achievements, but also it is a proof that without cooperation, we're going to lose some of the things that we've been given, especially when we talk about the global commons being the inheritance of an atmosphere that's going to provide for stable climate, biodiversity that's going to provide for pollinating of our food system, for example, but also water circuits, oceans that are intact and provide for a lot of food. So yes, I think that probably puts out the framework with what we're talking about here today.
Thank you very much for that. Marcela Escobari, the environment we face at the moment, people have had to oscillate between altruism and individualism because obviously we've had a pandemic, then we have big security concerns in this part of the world. So what incentive does the state now have in managing to really invest in cooperation and keeping access to these types of global commons and global public goods?
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here again. And let me start by making a plug that the U.S. government is organizing, hosting the Summit of the Americas in a month. First time in the last 20 years. And I'm wondering if there's some St. Gallen students that we can borrow, if they can put away their finals. Just to say, this is an amazing conference. And I think this topic, as usual, in St. Gallen kind of has nailed the moment. Because as Maya was saying, there is this massive provision of these global public goods. And I think it's a bit of the reason that Maya explained, where we know that our problems are increasingly global, right? Climate change, war, famine, and require this collaboration. Yet our economic and political structures are local, are short-term. We have elections every 4 years. In the US, maybe even every 2 years. So, but we can't deny this interconnectedness in the challenges we face. And if we do it at our peril. And there have been multiple examples in history where we have given up power, collaborated, and added to the sovereign benefit. I think that we had this previous panel talk about the organizations that allow us to do that, right? These multilateral organizations, the UN, the WTO, Gavi, COVAX, like our enchantment with them tends to go up and down, and they're definitely, wildly imperfect, but we need more of that rather than less. And just to add to the list of things, one of the topics that I think requires this is, the massive movement and dislocation of people, to add to the urgency of climate change.
Yeah, I want to get to migration in just a second's time. Just an early thought, Mr. Durão Barroso. I remember you from your time at the European Commission as President of the European Commission during such a difficult time when countries needed bailouts, getting everybody around the table, stakeholders even outside of the EU, private, public sector cooperation. And then at the end of the day, your average person is thinking, well, I just want to make sure that I have money in my bank account, that I have financial security, that I can plan for the future. How difficult was it then? Do we take for granted the type of cooperation? Have we taken for granted the type of cooperation that is needed at this multilateral, scale? And is there a breakdown in communication of how important these institutions are to your average person?
So first of all, I think financial security or financial stability is another of the global public goods.
Yeah.
Adding to those that were already mentioned, from climate change to global public health and the highest value of all is peace, global peace. I would say that it was extremely difficult, as you remember well. Every time I was giving interviews to CNN and others, I was getting the question, when is Greece going to leave the euro? I had difficulty to explain that Greece was not going to leave the euro and that the euro will be sustainable over time, and we have done it. But it was extremely challenging. But if I compare the situation then to the situation now, in terms of the global community, it's much worse now.
How so?
I can give an example, for instance, G20. The G20 at the heads of state and government level, in fact, it was ourselves, the European Union. It was a president of France that at that time was the rotating presidency. It was President Sarkozy and myself. We went to speak with President George W. Bush at Camp David, when there was a financial crisis, saying, look, we need to organize something because G8 is not sufficient. At that time, it was G8. Putin was there. Yeah. By the way, Putin, just for curiosity, is the leader outside the European Union that I met the most. I met him 25 times, which is, I'm not especially proud of it, but that's the reality. Because at that time, we had twice a year summit with Russia, and also I met him also in the G8 and G20 in bilateral meetings. But then we asked, it was in 2008, the American president to organize the first G20 summit. And in fact, it was in Washington, already after the election of Obama, but still with George W. Bush as president. Then the second was in London with Gordon Brown. The third was already with Obama. It was in Pittsburgh, and so on. At that time, I have to say the G20 worked relatively well. For instance, China supported the euro. That's probably not very much public. But I sent a mission to China, and they were buying bonds of the so-called periphery countries when others were selling. And at least we avoided the return to naked, ugly protectionism. We're pushing for keeping the global economy open to avoid what happened in the 30s, after the crash of the 30s. So basically, I will say that the situation was relatively manageable. European Union has always took decisions. By definition, the European Union is incremental, is fragmented, takes time, very frustrating, slow. But at the end of the day, we have done our job. So we kept all the countries in the euro, and the euro is the second most important currency in the world today, against all odds of all the prophets of doom. Now, today, after it was not just because of this war, awful invasion of Ukraine by Russia, of course. That is, for me, the world is a completely different world after the 24th of February. And I will advise those who have not yet understand it to try to understand it. The world will never be the same after what happened in the 24th of February this year. Because there is a real risk of deglobalization, probably not yet complete reversal of globalization, but decoupling. But that decoupling, in fact, was aggravated and accelerated by the pandemic, because there was an onshoring of many supply chains. I mean, the European Union, from that point of view, is an interesting example. The European Union had no access to some personal protective equipment, but today the European Union is the biggest producer and exporter of vaccines. It was not like that before the pandemic, but immediately the Europeans have tried to correct that situation. And that is interesting because I think the new name of globalization will be regionalization. There will be a trend to put things more at the regional level. But even before the pandemic, that accelerated some of these trends, we had already the conflict between the United States and China. And from that point of view, the real important moment was the Huawei moment, because it means a decoupling, technological decoupling. And why? Partly because those who control technology will also control the instruments of war. So the real problem here is that some of those global public goods, they are being weaponized. There is a weaponization of everything. Energy, energy security should be one of the global public goods, but now it's an instrument of war. And so on and so forth. And also
migration?
Migration. That was, Belarus sending the refugees to Poland and other countries. So it was an example. And can you imagine what will happen in the world if we have weaponization of infectious diseases? That's why we need to have, as far as possible, common understanding and commitment to a multilateral approach to avoid this fragmentation of the global community. But I'm very pessimistic now. And usually I'm not pessimistic, as you know, when you interviewed me for CNN. I'm usually not a pessimistic person. But what's happening now, it's really extremely dangerous because it's changing completely the balance globally. And we are going to live with a much more fragmented. But when you speak about organizations, it's easy to put the blame on UN or WTO or WHO, but these international organizations can only deliver what the member states allow them to deliver. So it's not fair to put the blame on them. And I don't believe that there will be some kind of engineering that solves the problems. That's good for some think tanks to work on that, great. But look, at the end of the day, it's an issue of political power and political commitment of the most relevant stakeholders, the most important powers from the United States to China, and Europe as well. Europe is more powerful than usually people think. At least economically, and so to put some order in this extremely fragmented world. And that's how I think it's really a challenge for the new generation. If we want to keep those global public goods, because I believe we need them, I'm a strong multilateralism. If you want to keep them, we need to find the ways, in spite of all this fragmentation, I think is unavoidable, so let's have no illusions, we'll go for this fragmentation. But nevertheless, to try to have a dialogue globally that we can encapsulate, we can isolate those issues where we disagree, but we keep some where we agree. For instance, if we don't have China, and this is my last point, if we don't have China on board, it will be impossible to fight climate change. Even if tomorrow Europe has zero emissions, it will have no impact, frankly, no impact. Or almost irrelevant. Political, certainly, to have impact. But the biggest polluter is China. So we need the United States, we need China, we need Russia, we need India. And that's challenging. How are we going to commit collectively to deliver some common public goods when we have the world geopolitically fragmented? And I believe the world will continue to be fragmented for a long time.
Maria, we have a lot of, paradoxically, we have lots of examples of huge cooperation recently, particularly I'm thinking about sanctions on Russia, eventually when the vaccine programs got up and running and there's sharing of vaccines and scientific know-how to combat COVID-19. But they're by no means consistent. And then at the same time, we've also got fractures of that kind of system. Your thoughts on where the balance is at the moment? Are you optimistic or as pessimistic as Sir Durão Barroso?
No, I think the point that we really look at a complete geopolitical shift hasn't really resonated with a lot of people. I think, they're still looking at this being a short-term, at least in the wider public, this being a short-term thing, and then we'll get back to normal. Normal meaning something we're used to in the past. And then, obviously, we've been collaborating a lot on the scientists between countries to say we are going to have to transform our world, which is the tagline of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were very clear about the sharing between countries has to be something that becomes more just. And within countries, the sharing has to become more just. So the ecological crisis and the social inequality crisis already bringing also within countries, we've seen a lot of that populist upsurge in the ones that are rich and should be the benefactors or, the beneficiaries of the globalization that we've had. So I think the urge for going towards more autonomy through resource efficiency, so saying we're going to grab less of the resources that are available on the planet, is a very important and a good one that would combine the things that we're leading away in showing how something can be done without running down the global commons. At the same time, not to just drop it, because I think that would be a repeating of history where some countries, through the international restructuring programs, IMF, etc., felt they were being brought into a very export-oriented development model, which is very commodity-orientated, not have a lot of the developing of the supply chain within their countries, which included wage pressure there. If you're competing on the export markets, especially for commodity pricing rather than for final products, you don't have as much as an incentive to pay higher wages internally because you're not necessarily thinking about this raising purchasing power of your own people. So you don't have the positive feedback loops that a lot of the trade thinkers were thinking about why interlocking countries' supply chains has a positive spirit. And I think the spirit around this law is something we really have to look at. Has it been partnerships, and has they stayed partnerships where we were looking at how can both countries really benefit and how can we regenerate the goods that are being created and the ones that we're using? Or has it turned more and more into slightly suspicious contractual relations where it's about the exploitation of resources or raw materials that we need? And as soon as that's exploited, we're not necessarily so much interested anymore. And I think there's a degree of honesty that we need to have in our own discussions. I sometimes miss that right now, especially when there's so much looking at who's the bad and who's the good guy. All of a sudden, we're celebrating our liberal democracies as the value-based model for the future. If everyone had behaved the way that we had, we would not have come to protecting the global goods. We've had Global Overshoot Day yesterday in Germany. That means we had, in our economy, used up our fair share of what a planet can regenerate. So if we're coming into more honestly really thinking about how can we now, in the process of redesigning some of those, be it forced to have to redesign, or also something that could be an invitation that might get us out of this whole stigma between developing, developed world, but really learn from each other how it can work, it might be the way forward that can promise more peaceful relations, because otherwise, it's not only them not lowering or meeting climate change, it's us needing the resources under their territories to get electrification going in our spaces.
So more accountability, more transparency,
yes,
more dialogue,
a bit more honesty.
I hear you loud and clear. Marcella, where do you see there being opportunities and a need for collaborative advantage? In particular, with your agency and the remit that you have over Latin America and the Caribbean, migration is a huge issue, isn't it?
Yes, which again, I partly came to this conference to learn about how, Europe is working together in managing the Ukraine crisis, which despite the pessimism and all the horrible things you mentioned, Mr. Barroso, it's true that we are seeing this incredible coordinated response in sanctions. There is, incredible kind of generosity in countries opening their borders and their living rooms to Ukrainians. We all have the question: will it last? Is it sustainable? Can we deal with the root causes of this massive displacement? But we are dealing with the same thing in Latin America, right? We've had 6 million Venezuelans that had fled this kind of kleptocratic criminal regime that has contracted an economy by 80%, right? This is like the largest contraction outside of a war zone in our history, and adds to that is 7% contraction of Latin America post-COVID, and it means 7 million people are displaced within Latin America, and we are seeing also some kind of magnanimous countries like Colombia, that I think probably here equates to Poland, that have opened their borders to 2 million Venezuelans, giving them temporary protective status, the ability to come out of the shadows, be part of the judicial system, be part of the labor force, like in a very proactive, bold way. You have a select other set of countries that have done something similar, like Costa Rica or Ecuador, who's conceiving of these policies. But we are in a very unique tipping point where either countries are going to follow that and do the burden sharing, or countries are going to lock their borders and usher migrants to the next border, right? And if most countries do that, then it becomes an unbearable for any country to weather this kind of massive flows. So it is exactly typical commons problem that if we all burden share, collaborate, coordinate, this could decrease human suffering in a tremendous way, but also eventually be an economic boom for the region, or it can go in the opposite way. And as USAID, we're working very hand in hand with Colombia, registering folks, expanding education in schools and training journalists on anti-xenophobic press, et cetera, right? And we hope to do that with many other countries and in our own, right? We've got to create labor pathways in the US. But I think it is, it requires that collaborative work that is not happening in Latin America right now, and we hope it does.
But the asymmetries remain, don't they, in terms of attitudes in different countries, the willingness of some other neighbouring countries not necessarily wanting to officialise people who've come into their borders. As you said, in theory, economically, it should be a win-win. How do you view, with what you're seeing in Latin America, with the example of Colombia, what would be your prediction for what might happen here in Europe? Because obviously there's huge amounts of refugees who will continue to come as long as this war continues.
Well, we have seen examples in history where countries have been willing to give up power, give up control for their sovereign benefit, right? We have done it in very narrow ways with refugees. We have done it with the Montreal Convention, right? When we see the threat being there. Europe has had the experience in Syria. It's doing something different with Ukraine, right? The question is whether keeping sovereignty, keeping this decision, we can still act in a collaborative manner and coordinated manner. So we are taking note and hoping, and again, what we need to do and how we support, and the agency that I work on, is we need to make sure that if Colombia does this, it is a success. It translates to economic benefit. And if that happens, then countries are willing to do it. The problem is timing, right? That collaboration needs to happen in parallel. And we don't have the regional institutions that Europe does to be able to manage this. And it has done it in record time.
And so being able to show and demonstrate is also crucial for keeping the political momentum going. How can humanity agree on what public goods are important, how to maintain access to them? I'm thinking notably about the migration crises that Europe had when you were, of course, at the helm of the Commission towards the end of your time. What are your thoughts on how you can change that narrative to make sure that cooperation is still in the forefront of people's minds?
I think we need, that's a question of almost ideology or doctrine. What kind of world do we want? Do we want openness or do we want closure? In fact, I see the world now as a conflict, a contradiction between flux and friction. On one side is flux of goods, of services, of capital, of people, of ideas. On the other side, it's friction. It's protectionism, nationalism, nativism, isolationism. Okay? Europe, what I know better, basically still on the free side, on flux. By the way, the European itself is a laboratory for globalization because it's by far the most advanced case in history of countries sharing sovereignty. Because in fact, in many countries, starting with the common currency, our governments are not sovereign. It's DCB who is sovereign. So this is an unprecedented in terms of such a big group of countries now, 19 countries in the euro area, and also in other matters also. I believe it works. So it's not perfect, I know well. I'm having 10 years trying to get consensus there, let me tell you, I know the difficulties very well. But when you compare with other parts of the world, including because of lack of institutions, I think it's okay. It's going to make some progress. The concern I have is now at the global level, because the most important development of the last decades was the rise of China. The United States do not accept that rise of China. Let's put it clear. Don't accept. China wants to project power. Economically, it's already very strong, but it wants to project geopolitical power. Russia is a power. For me, Putin is a product of resentment. In fact, they are declining economically. It's amazing if you compare Russia with China. It's a complete failure economically, and not only economically. But Putin is using the only, let's say, instruments he has is the instruments of war. And they are the second global power in terms of military, including nuclear, by the way. And so we are going to see a much more fragmented world. I personally, and I think most Europeans, we believe in multilateralism. We want to keep the world as multilateral as possible. But I think, to be honest, we should acknowledge that there are those difficulties. And by the way, some time ago, the European Union, the Chinese did not like it, but they accepted as a new doctrine leading with China, saying China is at the same time a rival, a competitor, and a partner, which is true. China is a rival the model of society in Europe is not the Chinese, so we are rivals. But it's a competitor in economic terms, of course, and it's a partner for fighting climate change or some global politics. So we have to make a distinction on the issue. And that's why it is extremely challenging, because we have to avoid black and white solutions. We have to see in what matters we can keep the flow of diplomacy, of politics going, if we want to keep this world more open. I'm one of those who think that it's possible to be patriotic, as I am, to be a citizen of Europe for those who are European, and to be a globalist in the good sense of the word, because that's sometimes used negatively, to believe in mankind, to believe we are all parts of the same human species, to believe in human beings. But now, speaking about Russia, there is the brothers Karamazov from Dostoevsky. There is a personage who says, at some point he says, my father liked mankind in general, but hated every individual in particular. That's mankind as a concept. No. When I speak about mankind, I speak about each man, woman, or child. Each person. To accept that the most important thing is human dignity. Every human being, each human being, and not abstract. And this is a question of doctrine and the political attitude that requires leadership. Are we ready for that? It depends. I mean, what's going to be the future? It depends on you, namely on younger generation. Because I think it's still open, but it's challenging now, because if you want to keep the world open with all these negative, what I call friction forces, it requires a lot of political intelligence, commitment, and really ingenuity.
So you've got to have you can have cooperation, some confrontation and competition, but you have to keep the dialogue moving.
Communication going on,
and
yes.
communication channels open. Let's start taking some questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question for our esteemed panelists? There we go, one there.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for the really great panel. So my question is a bit, So my question is a bit different in the sense that right now I notice that a lot of the conversations around the symposium has been about how we can rely on institutions to govern public goods, for example. But one thing that I'd like to sort of acknowledge also is that it's institutions that got us here in the first place. Mm-hmm. So when we look at public goods and when you study it as in an academic kind of format, Elinor Ostrom, like a Nobel Prize winner, I think, actually mentioned about a few rules for governing the commons. Some of them involve defining who the public was, relying on norms rather than like the rule of law, for example, and also to ensure that the boundaries of these norms were well respected. And so I'm quite curious if you might have a perspective, any of the panelists actually, if there might be new ways of coordinating the management of public goods to manifest this collaborative advantage that we're trying to look out for.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question. Can I ask you first, Marcela Escobari, to take that question, and then Maria, maybe?
Very deep question. A couple of responses to that. So, one, it is true that you're right, we're here because of what we have, but I also feel that sometimes when things are not going well, we're like, well, done with that, let's try something new. And sometimes that's not necessarily the answer, right? It's like, yes, I can pile on the UN like anybody else. I used to be the biggest critic of, how USAID could do better until I had to sit on this seat and understand all the all the things that it has to deal with. So I do think there's an angle of institutions matter, they're hard, we want to do something tomorrow, but the build out, and this is coming from a region where this is, why we see the ups and downs is really important, and we got to continue on that. At the same time, I think there is, it was interesting in the previous conversation in this panel around whose responsibility is it? Is it like us, leaders, policymakers? Is it you? You should go protest. Look, like we can't deny responsibility of leading, of being bold decisions. And this is a little bit of what you've seen, in kind of an astonishment of people and governments being bold about what the right thing to do is, right? That is as leaders, our role. We need to be bold and about what, the right decisions and about our shared humanity. And then every individual needs to be the change they want to see in the world, right? Host a Ukrainian in your living room, accept a Haitian kid in your school, don't use air conditioning, which you already don't use in Switzerland, right? Like we've got to do the little things of reducing our carbon footprint as an individual to make sure those things add up. But I think it comes from both ways.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I think it is important to also see where it is happening. Because we have had moments of, for example, climate clubs or renewable energy clubs, where some of the countries that felt they want to collaborate more closely are moving the boundaries and are moving ahead and are saying, we're going to have a proof of concept that can work. And obviously, you have different rules of collaboration intensity, et cetera, within those. And then the interesting bit is how permeable are the boundaries to become part of that club? Is it becoming something exclusionary, or is it something that says, sorry, but we need to waver a bit having consensus? I think the EU has a lot of aspects where we're talking about where is the majority voting maybe a way out of parallelization. So there are these attempts to say some that are closer aligned in what they would like to achieve are trying to build vehicles of collaboration and institutions that move ahead faster. And I think one important one to go more local again was when Trump exited from the Paris Agreement, that a lot of lawyers, mayors, and a lot of regional governments said, no, we're still adhering to the Paris Agreement. We're still pushing ahead. I think one aspect that I would love for a lot of research to go into, for example, is because what Elinor Ostrom's concept is, and Hayek has the same, by the way. If you look at Hayek having different principles of collaboration within a smaller unit of people that tend to have a reputational aspect bounded into the sharing of a particular good. So you're meeting repeatedly, and you know you're part of the same crowd that are part of engaging with maintaining something. And we have evaded that bit for quite a lot of players, and I think the most significant ones being the financial markets. So we're right now awash in cash, but we've done research recently in Germany, 70% of the quantitative easing that's happened just goes within the financial markets, making money from money, and is not hitting the real economy anymore. And so unless we're structurally going into allowing for this to come down with all the effects that people are celebrating, how the stock markets are going up and down whilst causing the most severe speculative crisis for people that don't have access to food. That is a mismatch that would not happen if they were sharing the same space and would meet. And so that's where institutions and power come in, and where a disjunction of the principles that could allow for this steering, which are very norm-based, has to be either built, which technologies could help for us if we want to have it globalized, or do we have to talk about some re-regionalizations in the terms of who am I accountable to when I'm trying to make a lot of cash? We have a very extractive financial sector right now. It's not working in a regenerative way, which is exactly what the principles of Ostrom would lead it to.
Mr. Barroso, what do you think about
I think about institutionals, but we already spoke briefly. I think we cannot ask international organizations to deliver what their members do not want them to deliver. So it's completely unrealistic to think that the United Nations will change itself. The Security Council. I mean, do you see, frankly, Russia or China or the United States or UK or France giving up their veto right? Frankly, I mean, 50 years from now, I think we are going still to be here discussing this if there is United Nations. But I believe it's better to have United Nations than not to have it. So that's the point. So politics is always the domain of counterfactual. We can always express frustration, but we have to think, would you be better without it? Would the world be better without the United Nations, without WHO, without the WTO? I don't think so. Or Europe, would Europe be better if we have now 27 countries competing for vaccines instead of having done it together? And by the way, issuing for the first time against what was said during the financial crisis, now finally accepting issuance of common debt? No, of course not. Now, but there are things we can do. I call it institutional imagination. Some of you may know the book of Wright Mills, Sociological Imagination. This institutional imagination is to create some other organization. By the way, now I'm chair of Gavi since 2021, pro bono activity I have. And Gavi has been a very big success. The first chair was Nelson Mandela. It was created more than 20 years ago, and it has been vaccinating poor children in poor countries, almost 900 million people. And what is the model of Gavi? I think it's a template, for instance, for climate change could be. It is an organization, legally speaking, is a Fondation de Droit Suisse, based in Geneva. It's a foundation, Swiss foundation, but it's an international organization, public-private partnership. It was founded by the World Bank, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and Bill Gates Foundation. And we have there the 5 countries that represent 5 constituencies of the so-called rich countries, donor countries. We have 5 countries representing the so-called implementing countries, developing countries. And we have representatives of the pharmaceutical industry from the global north and global south. We have representing research institutes, NGOs, CSOs, civil society organizations, and we have 8 independent members, among them the chair, the current chair, that we are selected on the basis of merit and not representing the country or this or that specific interest. And I think it's interesting because the public-private partnership were around a specific objective. The objective is immunization, okay? And it works. I mean, it has its own problems. The governance is quite complex, but it works. So maybe this could be a way not to replace, let's be realistic, but to complement the efforts of the so-called intergovernmental organizations we have globally. And I believe if we find, for instance, global education, global public health, global education, fight climate change, that could complement the effort. And we could put together the governments, because without the governments, at the end of the day, we cannot deliver, let's be honest, but also the private sector, the NGOs, the research, academia, and so on and so forth. The public and the private sector. I believe it is a way of moving something forward, but let's be honest, we cannot solve this issue only with that.
Marie, would you agree with that concept of having sort of add on different public-private institutions with a very focused goal to try and buffer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to look at learning from what didn't work in former public-private partnerships, because there quite often we've had the effect of privatizing the gains and then socializing the costs, because the investment in the maintenance of the infrastructure, be it the water piping or be it the railways, etc., wasn't put too much effort into, but the using of the provisioning was then paid for. So how do we learn from this? And I think when we're learning also from a renewable energy transition in Germany, how do we make sure that it's public-private people partnerships? So it's embedded into the place where people are living. And I think that would increase a lot of trust again also in the orientation of where are we going. Because we did have a change in law from a very community-based way of running the energy transition into a bidding process, which ended up that a lot of the smaller ones couldn't compete anymore. Mm-hmm. And then you had a lot of frustration because some external investor would come in, put up a windmill that people didn't particularly like, especially not if they weren't participating in what was made as a gain. So how do we make sure that revenue being created stays within the place that is impacted by what is being created there? Mm-hmm. I think that is part of the solution where we're going forward. And a lot of times we've done a Future Policy Award in the World Future Council at the time to try to understand under which conditions, because policy making is quite an art, under which conditions did it work out to really move ahead towards future-orientated policy making. It did always have a new mission, a very clear tagline of what we're trying to achieve, and it brought the whole system in the room. So trying to bring the supply chain in the room, for example, to provide for food security in Belo Horizonte was one of the examples. And then provide for, sometimes it just needs for an intermediating maybe that's the example that you're referring to, that really harnesses everyone's potential and levers in a new way, under a new purpose, but then also make sure that purpose is taken serious.
Just, if I may, you mentioned, for instance, when the United States left the Paris Agreement on climate change, you mentioned the cities.
Yeah.
That's a good example. So when we cannot have an agreement at intergovernmental level globally, and that was the case, what we're trying to do is to bring the cities, bring some states of the United States, like California, or some cities. So that's institutional creativity. And by the way, I believe the cities have a lot of things to do and make in the future, because more and more we are seeing that platform of cities, so mayors globally.
Right.
Of course, I'm not saying that's a panacea. No, I'm saying that depending on the issue, we may have some creativity in creating institutions that are adapted to some. In some cases, it will be private sector. In some cases, it will be public sector. What some countries call the third sector, so the philanthropic or the social sector. It depends on the issue. It's, as we say in European Union, variable geometry. It's variable geometry.
Let's take a few more questions. Oh, wonderful. We'll start from this side. Make sure I try and get everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful panel. I want to not switch the conversation, but ask particularly about, given that we are in a university, about international education and the state of international education. I think one area in which there was immense optimism in the post-Cold War era was exactly in the belief that investing in student mobility and bilateral academic and scientific cooperation would be, it was a win-win situation for all over the world. There was almost universal agreement around there. Working in the European Union, Zamora was part of the European University Institute, which is perhaps a great example of Erasmus and the Bologna process, DAAD as institutions that are in Germany, and USAID and the State Department, so many initiatives. And I think we're living a very different scenario right now, right? And at least with much less optimism regarding the potentials of academic mobility and international education. So I just, wanted to open the floor and ask the three of you, what went wrong in the last 30 years? Why are we in a more pessimistic state? And what are your views on the roles of universities, governments, and other non-governmental organizations in the field of international education? Thank you.
Do you mind if I ask Marcella to take that?
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm incredibly enthusiastic about these programs. I think when we look at the history of USAID, probably there's consensus that undeniably are, the effect that you can't measure immediately, but has had the biggest effect is our people-to-people programming, and the Fulbrights, the Peace Corps, and we had these programs. To be honest, the Trump administration shrunk everything from every form of migration in tremendous ways, and we're going to have to rebuild. And then COVID, of course, hit that, and when everybody closed their borders. But it's an incredible win-win, and we should, and I will work toward increasing those goals. State Department believes in the same thing, and we need to reinvent, and we have them, but we need to grow them. I completely agree with you.
Now, we're tight on time, so I'm just going to take another question. Thank you. So if you keep your hand up, the glasses, yeah. We'll take both questions at the same time.
Hello, thank you for the session. My question is on digital public goods. And when we talk about digital, we will see that we have another very powerful stakeholder, which is the technology corporations. And my question is to the panelists, which is how can we ensure that there is a framework for common digital public good, on top of which private innovation can happen and not the other way around?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take the other question too. Thanks.
Hello. So my question is again bringing us back to the vaccine governance and diplomacy that has happened in the world in the last 2 years. So very contradictory to what we are discussing right now. I'm not actually seeing vaccines being recognized as a global public good right now. And in the way the distribution has taken place, it's more on the basis of geopolitics and how countries have given vaccines to their allies and not to the countries who actually need them. And so we see that the global north today has more vaccines that they need, and there is vaccine hoarding that has taken place on their end. And they are discussing about a 4th booster dose, whereas a first dose remains lacking in the most poorest countries in the world today. So how can we say that vaccines are actually global public goods and not private ones, which are imminently excludable and rival in nature? Thank you.
Can I ask Mr. Barroso to take that?
Probably about that.
question?
No, the answer to that was the vaccines. It's more mixed picture because, in fact, COVAX has distributed now almost 1.5 billion vaccines. It's by far the biggest effort, multilateral in history, for 145 countries. But the equity problem remains there. And why that problem? Because, as you said, there was hoarding from the richer countries, but there was also export restrictions, and not only from the richer countries. And there was some bad behavior of some governments and some companies, some manufacturers. That's the reality. That's why, in fact, we saw the limits of international cooperation there. Once again, would it be better not to have COVAX, not to have a multilateral scheme? In that case, it will be much worse. Because more than 88% of the vaccines that the low-income countries received, they were distributed through COVAX, not through bilateral or other agreements, because some of those countries simply have not the money or they did not have the access. Because what happened was, for instance, when the pandemic started, COVAX was buying the vaccines at the most lower price because it has buy at scale. But the countries, those who have more money and more capacity, they were jumping the line. That's basically, I mean, simplifying, that's what happened. And the companies were, of course, very happy, some of them, to sell at a higher price because it was very convenient for them. And that explains. That's why, for instance, now we just had I hosted with the Chancellor of Germany recently and we got an additional 8.8 billion for another pledging conference for COVAX, precisely to constitute a vaccine pool. So for the next pandemic or the next wave of the pandemic, because we are not yet out of this pandemic, let's be clear about it, not yet out of the pandemic, and there is surge in some parts of the world, that we are able not to be the last in the line, but we can assure that a fair proportion goes to the countries that are most vulnerable. But at some point last year, 2021, I can tell you we were, with enough money, we have raised 10 billion, more than $10 billion. By the way, great generosity of some countries. The United States was number one, and I want to praise the American administration for that. But at the same time, there was that money, but there was not a possibility because we had no vaccines. Because the richer countries, they kept the vaccines for them. And now they are donating, but at some period we could not. And there were also export restrictions, namely from India. India is one of the biggest producers of vaccines, but India had a terrible pandemic. And of course, and by the way, it's legal. When there is an issue like that, it's legal to concentrate first on their own population, then on any kind of a trade agreement. So that explains the situation where we were. And the difficulties. That's why we need to prepare for the next pandemic. And I believe with the truly legal commitments of the different stakeholders.
Maria, thank you very much. Let's hope the world has learnt their lesson and we won't soon have to face another pandemic like we've seen. Could I ask you to take the last question about the tech framework, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I think the very first aspect is exactly what you're doing, is call it that. Because we have seen the whole space emerging as something where individual companies are developing new products and then they're providing for new services. But what we're talking about is the infrastructures, the social and commercial infrastructures of the future. And once you talk not much about products anymore, but infrastructures, you totally see that there has always been a co-responsibility between the public and the private. And just to have the courage and turn the discourse around that is, for me, step one. And we see it emerging in Europe. And we had impetus, well, on the German government, I don't know whether we're at it right now, to say we need a UN charter on digital being a public good and how can it support, for example, a sustainability transformation. So how do you make a new technological revolution serve goals that we've already had, rather than private interests running a technological revolution through our societies with little checks and balances, with business models that wouldn't qualify as sound business models under our old definition, and then basically, trying to run after them and plead them to adhere to the rules of the game. So yes, calling it that is the very first step. And then we can talk about which are the governing frameworks under which we want the infrastructures of commerce and communication in the future to be run, including the responsibilities that we have put on similar providers of media channels, etc. before. We don't even have to reinvent much. We just have to apply the rules that we've had for particular services or businesses in the past to that sector. Why should it be exempt from that? But that courage is necessary. And then get out of this stupid discourse to say it's going to inhibit innovation. No, we want innovation to serve something. Otherwise, it's not an innovation. The purpose has to be clear and not just declared. It has to be lived purpose. And this is the way I think we should confront.
Marcelo Escobar, just very briefly, is there a particular structure around a particular common global good, global common, that you think works, that people can build upon, that offers a good framework? Something that jumps to mind?
This is the easy question for 30 seconds. Yes, there are examples, obviously, and the examples, unfortunately, tend to work with things that are very concrete. Like we all know vaccines are good. We all know that, primary education is good. Not dying out of COVID is good, right? So it becomes easy for people to coalesce. It becomes harder when there are some winners and some losers, as is with climate. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, embrace this and use the similar models there. And my last point to add to the digital question that was asked, not only is regulating and working in this digital space important for the public good aspect, but the abuses of it, right? And the misinformation, which I see affecting vaccine hesitancy in Latin America, affecting elections. And here, leaders, like we've seen in Europe, right? Because they're globalized markets and global companies, when you have GDPR, when you have your digital services laws, as imperfect as they are, they tend to lead the world. And I think we have to continue to experiment and improve on those parameters. People have talked about the idea of FDA of digital algorithms, right? If we can regulate the goods that we bring inside of our bodies, also inside of our minds.
Just briefly, José Manuel Barroso, or Durão Barroso, as my husband calls you in Portugal. I know this isn't relevant to this particular panel, but since you broached the subject of how many meetings you had with President Putin over the years, I think it would be interesting just to hear your answer to this. At the time when now, retrospectively, Russia's argument has been that the EU expanded, NATO's expansion, Russia and President Putin is viewed as hostile. Did you ever get an inclination in any of those 25 meetings that you thought he would unleash war on Ukraine?
Not this kind of war, but it's public information. In 2014, when there were the first Russian troops going in Crimea, I spoke with him, asked what's happening. And he said, look, these are some tourists, there are Russians there, they were called by the other brothers on the other side, but this is not armed forces of Russia, he said, because if it was the Russian army, we will take Kiev in less than 2 weeks. He said it in 2014. I, of course, informed my colleagues of the European Council, and afterwards there was a leak. I will not say where the leak comes from, but it appeared in the Italian newspaper. And then the Kremlin did not deny. They said the statements, they were very angry. They said the statements were taken out of context, but did not deny. So the question is, in 2014, was he already planning this or not? Or was this, in a Freudian interpretation, the involuntary manifestation of a hidden desire? We don't know. Anyhow, I always thought that Putin will destabilize all this region. Afterwards, since that Crimea. That was my guess. But I was not expecting him to launch a full-scale attack, even trying to to complete control Ukraine. That I was not expecting, because it's beyond imagination. And by the way, I believe it's a mistake also on his side, because it's a tragedy for Ukraine, but it's very bad for Europe and for the world, but it's also bad for Russia. It's a strategic mistake of Russia from my point of view. Having said that, for me, he's going to keep that situation. He wants a victory. He wants a victory. He will not accept any kind of compromise before he has a clear victory. That's why I'm negative. It's not because I want to be negative, and we have to be prepared for the long run, with this conflict. Because even if by miracle tomorrow has an agreement with Russia, I mean, Ukraine and Russia have an agreement, I mean, do you believe there will be an unwind of sanctions against a country we say that the president is a criminal, a war criminal? That's really not. Something I learned in Brussels is that it's very difficult for the European Union to take decisions, but even more difficult to change decisions once they are taken. Yeah. So there will be, this situation is going to last. It's impossible in the short term to conceive a possibility of a settlement, a true reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. It is impossible to conceive it.
So the reason I'm asking this is because you talked about how peace should be a global good, that we should pay more attention. Do you personally, does it keep you up at night ever thinking, did we perhaps take peace for granted in this part of the world? I mean, during your time?
What was the alternative? No, what was the alternative? By the way, just to correct, because to be precise, Putin is on record saying that he had nothing against Ukraine, even joining the European Union. He said to me several times, we negotiated 5 years, and he said it publicly. What he said was that Ukraine joining NATO, but Ukraine was not going to join NATO. Everybody knows that. But members of NATO did not want Ukraine to join NATO. So this is a pretext. So it's not, it's his strategy, it's communication, but it's not true. Simply not true. What he does not want is a Ukraine that becomes more European, more westernized. He wanted Ukraine to be a kind of a Belarus too. He wants a vassal state. And so we have a problem here. At the end of the day, it's a problem, a very difficult problem, because the contradiction between justice and peace. Because if you want peace, we have to give up on justice. But we don't want to give on justice. We want to recognize the right of Ukraine to follow its own path.
And as the gentleman there in the first question made the point, respect the rule of law. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you for your extra patience for the extra couple of questions. Gentlemen, Barroso, Maria Gutierrez, and Marcelo Escobar. Thank you. Now, I believe...